My name is Jeff Raderstrong, and I'm going to quickly walk through um, the explanation and frame of this research, and then go a little bit into the components. Again, a lot more information is available on our website. First, go over the agenda. I'll first talk about how we got to this point in our research, and a little bit of our methodology behind the research. I'll give you a quick overview of what we found through researching community engagement and collective impact, and then go into the individual components like I mentioned. The first component is around this question of figuring out the why, figuring out your goals for working with community, and then I'll talk more about the different dimensions of how to work with community. There's one dimension around amplifying the voice of community, and then another dimension about creating feedback loops. So first, a little bit about how we got here. And this part was actually presented by my colleague, the Director of Collective Impact, Tynesia Robinson, who unfortunately wasn't able to come to this secondary recording of the webinar. So to talk more about our methodology, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the Living Cities approach to doing field level research like this. Living Cities is a funding collaborative of 22 of the world's largest foundations and financial institutions, and we work to build a new type of urban practice to dramatically improve the economic well-being of low-income people in the United States and U.S. cities. And so we approach this work using three different levers. We focus on capital innovation, public sector innovation, and collective impact. We have a team that's focused on collective impact, and we support collective impact initiatives in over 70 cities on a wide range of issues, from education to workforce development to health and economic development. And we use these different initiatives as learning labs to better understand what the field as a whole is struggling with. And so once we identify a gap in the field, we work with our partners to figure out how to fill that gap and accelerate the work being done across the country. And so within this collective impact portfolio, we also, and not only the collective impact portfolio, but our work with public sector, we saw this need for creating more applicable tools to work with community members better. And so, as you all know, collective impact has been criticized as being too top-down and not in touch with local communities. And so we began this work by interviewing our members to figure out how they approach community engagement through collective impact, and then we came up with a rough synthesis paper of the different options for working with communities through collective impact. Once we spoke with these individuals, we decided to talk with other practitioners in the field, including folks at Tamarack, to refine this thinking on community engagement and to make sure that what we were found resonated with the field. So what we're presenting today is a summary of the research that we came up with. And once we actually created this research synthesis, we decided to create an e-course using the different resources that we offered. And this e-course was free of charge, and we worked with around 2,500 registrants to see if what the synthesis of research resonated with them. And based on our initial data analysis, we found that in fact these approaches that I'm about to speak on did resonate with folks. Again, I'm going to briefly go over some of the findings from the research that we did on community engagement and collective impact. And before I go into more detail, I'll give a brief overview of those findings. So our research and our conversations with practitioners highlighted the need to consider three main components of working with community members in collective impact. The first component is this question around the why. Before doing any work with community members, it's important to figure out why you are doing this work. But once these goals have been set, that we found that was not enough to effectively work with community members, and that even collective impact initiatives with a clear understanding of why they want to work with community members still struggle to engage with community groups effectively. And so there was a need to focus on the strengthening the capacity of a collective impact initiative across two different dimensions. The first dimension is around what we're calling amplifying the voice of community, and the second is around building feedback loops with community members. So I'll talk about each of these components in turn. So first, this question of why. This is a really important question because community engagement means different things to different people. To some, it's about grassroots organizing, town hall meetings, board leadership, things like that. And to some people, community engagement is this very static process where you can do community engagement, check the box, and move on and get on with it. Of course, this is really not true. You really need to be clear about why you want to work with community members and who you want to do that work with. And there's a lot of reasons why this is important, but primarily it's important because community is never a monolith. You're never working just with one community with a unified thinking around goals and strategies. Instead, community is very diverse. Different groups have different motivations, and you're going to be working with these groups for different reasons. So it's important to be very clear about your goals for engaging specific community groups and the reasons why you're engaging with those groups. One example of this setting these goals and deciding these strategies, it comes from a collective impact initiative we support in Albuquerque, which has really effectively involved and actively involved community members in identifying how the city can encourage entrepreneurship, but they haven't really made community members a central part of their formal governance structure because they decided that was not a part of their goals. Instead, they decided that community input should shape the direction of the initiative and the strategies that they approach with the initiative, but they didn't need the community to be on the governance team, which was really primarily in charge of implementation. Instead, the implementation strategy was set by leaders that had an understanding of the relationships and dynamics of the city government and local economy of Albuquerque. And so I'll go talk a little bit more about this one specific tool that we found was really helpful for collective impact initiatives to set their goals and strategies for working with community groups. This is the what's called the community engagement spectrum or public participation spectrum, and it helps you and your initiative think through and segment out the community groups you want to work with and your goals for working with them. You can see that it goes the spectrum goes from informed to co-lead, and as you move to the right on the scale, it gets more, the level of involvement gets more in depth, and the level of engagement gets higher. And this has been used many different times, adapted by many different organizations, but it was originally developed by the International Association for Public Participation, and this particular version was adapted by the Collective Impact Forum from an adaptation from the Tamarack Institute. And we actually have a great exercise, also adapted from Tamarack, as a part of the e-course that our participants really liked, that helps you segment out your community members, the community groups you want to work with, the goals for working with them, and then strategies for working with them based on those goals. So I encourage you to go online and check that out. And through our research, we were looking at this spectrum and found that while collective impact initiatives need to identify strategies themselves based on this local context and this, again, the specific goals for working with community members, it was really important that for collective impact initiatives in particular, that at least those strategies at least need to have ambitions of involving community members or greater on the spectrum, because collective impact is all about inclusivity of varying stakeholders. And if there was no attempt at least to involve, collaborate, or have community members co-lead the initiative, it really wouldn't be in the spirit of collective impact. So again, while you need to figure out your strategies and goals based on your local context, we really feel like it is important for the model of collective impact that community members are at least at the involved stage of engagement, if not higher, in some capacity in your initiative. So now moving on to this first dimension of how. Once you have the why and your goals set, again, it's not as simple as just jumping right into the work. There's a lot of strategies and investments needed in these two different dimensions. And the first dimension deals with the amplification of the voice of community members. And this is a really important component because there are extreme disconnects in some communities between community members and residents and the leaders of those communities, the grass tops leaders, the politicians, the business leaders. There's a lot of reasons for this, and in the question and answer session, we spoke about it a little bit, about the historical impact of institutionalized racism, of segregation, that has really created a disconnect between communities and the leaders. And I encourage you to go to the e-course. We have a lot of information about racial equity in that you can learn more about why these barriers exist. But putting that aside, just because there's not nearly enough time to talk about those barriers today, we found that this frame of context experts versus content experts is a really great way to think about what voices within your community need to be amplified. The context experts are those residents with lived experiences that can contribute to collective impact. This is another way to think about community members themselves. Whereas content experts are the ones that have technical expertise useful for solving specific problems, and these are folks such as planners, affordable housing experts, or school superintendents. A lot of you probably listening to this recording fall into this content of content experts. Of course, this isn't a dichotomy. People are context experts in different areas and can become content experts, and content experts can become context experts. But the point of this frame is that you really need both content and context experts to make sure collective impact initiative is effectively meeting the needs of the community you're working with. So once you have this idea of context experts versus content experts set in your mind, and you know what you need to amplify, how do you better amplify the voice of those context experts? And again, through our research, we found many different tools for doing so. We'll highlight a few here that we found useful in our collective impact work. So the first is this concept of leadership trainings that take community members themselves and teach them how to serve on boards and commissions and on initiatives that they may not be familiar with. These can be low-income people who aren't used to a boardroom setting, who aren't used to a professional context as the content experts know it. And this puts them through a long, several month training process to increase their capacity to contribute in this context. There's two organizations, again, more information is online, that fill these roles, who provide these trainings. One is the Nexus Partners in Minneapolis, as well as the Urban Habitat organization, which is based out of California. Another approach is this idea of creating shared aspirations in which you work closely with community members and community groups to do a visioning process and a strategic planning process to determine what the shared vision, shared goals, shared aspirations are for a community and the community groups themselves. And the Harwood Institute has a lot of great resources out there around this and how to facilitate that process that are very in-depth and really helpful. And I encourage you to check them out at the Harwood Institute. Next is an idea of network building, in which you focus on creating individualized relationships between community members and grass tops leaders. There's a lot of different ways to do this. One organization we've worked with is called Trusted Space Partners, which sets up community meetings in which individuals offer some sort of service in trade for another service that another individual can provide, such as translation services or mowing someone's lawn or delivering food or picking someone up from the hospital, and that can really help create a community at an individual level between people. And then finally, there's this concept of grassroots or community organizing that I imagine a lot of you are familiar with. There's a lot of different approaches to funding grassroots organizing and community organizing. One example that we've worked with comes from the Minneapolis-St. Paul region and our collective impact work there, in which we supported a community engagement team that was focused around the build out of several transit lines in that region. The community engagement team supported and funded many different community-based organizations to advocate on behalf of the low-income community members that were affected by the transit planning there. And through this organizing, several policy changes were developed, and more equitable transit-oriented development was able to occur in the region and continues to this day. And so moving on from this dimension is this concept of feedback loops. And this is a really important concept to talk about, because even if you work on this amplification of voice and investing in community themselves, you can still have barriers to working effectively with community. This comes in the form of tokenism oftentimes. So you invest in an individual and an organization to have this community representation in some way, but that community input and representation isn't really incorporated back into the initiative. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this tokenism concept. And so one way to avoid this is to create feedback loops with the community themselves. And Ty, my colleague, director of Collective Impact for Living Cities, has actually written a lot about feedback loops. And the way she describes it is to say that they're fundamentally about collecting information that is needed to know whether or not you're on track with your work. And so these feedback loops need to be iterative and support continuous communication. And they fundamentally should help you work with the people you seek to help, so that together you can learn faster and develop lasting solutions. Feedback loops are going to look different depending on your local context, but they all need to involve some form of continuous data collection from community members and response to those community members. And to make these a little bit clearer, I'll offer up two quick examples of feedback loops at work in collective impact. The first comes from San Antonio. It's called the P16 Plus Council, and that used a data-driven approach to improve its services focused on reducing student absenteeism. It partnered very closely with school districts, and then were able to engage parents through that partnership. And they were able to, by collecting this data over time from parents, they were able to understand better the root causes of chronic absenteeism and design strategies to deal with those root causes. And so through this feedback loop, and as well as a lot of other work, they were able to eventually reduce chronic absenteeism by about 50%. The other example comes from the Albuquerque Collective Impact Initiative that I spoke about earlier. So for their work on small business growth and small business support, the mayor actually met with local entrepreneurs in very close or small meetings called deep dives to collect feedback on their process, the city's process for supporting entrepreneurship, and brought that input back to the Collective Impact Initiative. And they actually worked with a Milwaukee-based firm called Translator to help improve this feedback collection process. And one of the things that Translator recommended was that they create what they called a companion table, where community members were actually able to meet with themselves around these issues of entrepreneurship, and report directly to the initiative based on this feedback. So not only would they deliver feedback to the mayor directly, but they would also meet with themselves to create feedback or to determine their feedback and report that to the initiative itself. And so this idea of feedback loops is something that's relatively new to the field of collective impact. So I think there's a lot of research that still needs to be done around how these can be used effectively within collective impact. But we've found some different organizations that are working on feedback loops, not necessarily in collective impact, but with resources that may be helpful. So one is the Center for Effective Philanthropy, which focuses on feedback between grantees and foundations, and they have some information about that process. There's also an organization called the Fund for Shared Insight, which is actually funding research as well as work being done that connects nonprofits and their beneficiaries and strengthens feedback loops in that way. There's an organization called Markets for Good that's an initiative of several different funders that's really looking to convene people together around this idea of beneficiary feedback. And then Feedback Labs and Keystone Accountability are working more in the international development space around increasing feedback loops between citizens and their governments, NGOs and their beneficiaries, and they actually have what they're calling the feedback toolkit that has several different apps that can encourage feedback collection. And again, I encourage you to go to our website to learn more about this. And so just really quickly in summary, as I'm sure you've already gathered, there's a lot of overlap between these two different approaches of amplifying voice and creating feedback loops. So they're by no means dichotomous. As you begin to think about your community engagement strategies, I imagine you'll find some fill both needs. And again, it's really all about your goals for working with community members. And then once those goals are set, you can see how these two different dimensions will play out in your communities. But again, really what you need to do first and foremost is figure out that why. Before you do anything else, you really need to think through your goals for working with community members. And so these tools that we've presented today are things we've found useful in our work and that our partners have found useful in their work for thinking about community engagement. But we know there's a ton more out there, and we'd really love to hear from you about what you're doing and how you're working with community members. So please do share those lessons with us. Our contact information is there, and again, go to our website to learn more. So thank you very much.